Hi, welcome to a very special episode of Messier Mantra. For the first time ever, we're using modern technologies to bring you a guest from another part of the country. I believe he's in Huntsville, Alabama today. He's a really cool guy. He's got a great, interesting story that really affects me personally in a lot of ways. Conrad Thompson, what's up, man?
Hey, thanks for having me, man. How are you?
I'm doing good, and this is really going to be fun. I want to thank our station manager, Cody Piexoto, who's brought us together here through the wonders of Skype technology, because Conrad, you're kind of an inspiration to a lot of guys doing things with media that's outside the standard, 1970s or 1980s way, just doing their own thing. And we'll get into that. But first, I want to talk about your mortgage work and how that can help people. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about it?
Well, yeah, I appreciate that, man. I've been doing mortgages for 17 years now, and it's my first true love and passion. And we're able to help people become homeowners and give them an opportunity to get out of an apartment and into a house, and their family a backyard for a dog, and a front yard to play catch, and a chimney for Santa Claus, and everything in between. And we're really excited to be able to help people do that and sort of have the backdrop for their story, the stage for the story of their life. And we're routinely helping people who needed a second chance. So maybe if you had been turned down before, the bank said no, we can help you find a way to make it happen. And usually with no money down, and most of the time your mortgage payment is roughly what you've been paying in rent. And we can make that happen at hidefromrent.com.
Hidefromrent.com. And it's important because a lot of times when people hear the word mortgage, it's an intimidating word. They might feel that it's above their head or they don't have enough money. And what you're saying to folks is it actually is something that they can do, and you just put the human spin on it. It's really about enriching their lives. And if they're in a situation where they're paying rent every month, that might be expensive and they don't have that ownership. It's kind of a blunt expression, but paying rent is kind of like, you're just kind of peeing your money away or pissing your money away, to be more blunt. And for you to be able to help people do that puts the human side on the mortgage industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the reality is, I don't know any super successful, wealthy people who rent. And the way to do this is to get into a house, pay it off as quickly as possible. And then you really do have the peace of mind that you're really set. If you don't have any car payments or credit card debt or whatever, and you own your house free and clear, man, what a way to live. Being debt free is the way to make it happen, and not having to write a check every single month for those living expenses. And instead, now you've got an asset that actually appreciates, and it's worth more this year than it was last year, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, it's the way to be. And we make it fast and easy. And we do try to offer personal service, just as you've said, at hidefromrent.com.
And that's great, because a lot of wrestling fans, like myself, we kind of extend our childhood a bit, because, going to wrestling conventions or live pro wrestling shows, investing money in action figures or wrestling tickets, it can kind of, to be honest, like anything else, like a Star Wars obsession, or, people that love the band Kiss, or anything that kind of has a cultish type of mentality to it, it can become overwhelming. And so sometimes, years and decades go by and you find yourself not really having settled down into a life of debt-free living. And so what you're offering really is important, especially I think for a lot of pro wrestling fans that are probably watching this special episode of Messier Mantra.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk with you about it a little bit today.
Okay, great. So now let's segue into what people know you for. Obviously, much bigger exposure right now with Something Else to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard, without a T, and Conrad Thompson on the WWE Network. It's really quite a fun show. It's usually about a 2-hour show, and this is kind of the video version of, I dare say, your most popular podcast among several popular podcasts, Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard. And I've really been enjoying your show for about 2 years now. Why don't you tell us, but the thing is that one story leads to another, because I think your first podcast, was that with Ric Flair or Tony Schiavone, Conrad?
Ric Flair. It was Woo Nation for Play.it, and then eventually we went independent with the Ric Flair show, and then Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard, and then What Happened When with Tony Schiavone, and then 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff, and now Something Else to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard on the WWE Network.
And a lot of people were kind of wondering how you got started with this. And I remember hearing a story that you told that you basically just sent an email to Tony Schiavone, and it was kind of like a one email close. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, we had already done a show together for Ric Flair's Woo Nation, and so I had Tony's number, and I saw Tony steal the show at the NWA Legends Fan Fest in Charlotte. So I sent him a text message and asked if I could have his email. I had an interesting idea I wanted to shoot to him. And then I sent him, a multi-paragraph presentation. And it wasn't just, hey, we should do a podcast. It was a real business plan of, here's what the strategy would be for us to monetize this and make money. And this is a revenue stream for both you and I. And I didn't realize it, but behind the scenes, the guy he worked with in the radio business had been telling him for weeks, man, you got to listen to this podcast with Bruce Pritchard and Conrad Thompson. And Tony mentioned, I think I did a show with Conrad for Ric Flair. And he's like, oh man, if you did the WCW version of what Bruce is doing, it would be huge. Well, that had been happening behind the scenes for a few weeks and I didn't realize it. So when I sent the email, it was just right time, right place. And after I put all this thought into my presentation, Tony replied with 2 words, I'm in.
And that's got to feel good when you have that communication with someone whose work you respect and admire, and you've worked together a little bit, and now you're going all in, so to speak, for another adventure. That's great.
Yeah, we're having fun with it, man.
So Conrad, I've heard a lot of your shows, and most recently it was a fun episode of 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. And what was really interesting was towards the end of the show, Eric, surprised you with a special guest. You want to tell us about what happened with that?
Yeah, we were talking about Dusty Rhodes, celebrating the life of Dusty Rhodes, and then all of a sudden, he started talking about a third man, and he introduced a third man on the show, and I'm sort of thinking it's going to be his son Garrett or something like that, but in fact, it was the biggest star in the history of the business, Hulk Hogan himself, doing a run-in on 83 Weeks, and we didn't promote it or advertise it because I wanted the fans to be just as shocked and awed as I was, and it was quite the experience for me as a fan to get to talk to Hulk Hogan.
What was fun for me listening to it was just kind of, we went back to Conrad as a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old kid for a minute because we could hear the enthusiasm and the excitement of getting to speak with Hulk Hogan about Dusty Rhodes. And it's such an interesting business, and not only is professional wrestling industry interesting, but some of the modern technologies that could help and haunt people. And of course, with Hulk Hogan, we can't get away from the fact that right now he's kind of on the outs with WWE, but hopefully will be coming back, at least in my opinion. But you can see the other side of that where people are, hurt sensitivities or hurt from folks that were upset with what Hogan said in a very infamous situation with a lawsuit and everything. From my personal perspective, I kind of fear the day, Conrad, when all our privacy issues are up for grabs with, if we're always going to be on camera 24 hours a day and we can't say things even controversial or not the best things to say. But if we're always going to be videotaped 24 hours a day, what kind of civil liberties do we have anymore?
No, you're exactly right. It is very much a gotcha society now, and with TMZ and social media, there's no real privacy any longer.
And it's really interesting because the same type of things that we do love about social media, the ability to connect with people, the ability to have live time interactions, that same type of thing can snake bite you. And with Hulk's case, unfortunately for him, that's what happened and all that. But putting all that aside, I was really happy to hear Hogan talk about Dusty Rhodes, talk about the influence of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, on Hulk's career, because sometimes wrestling fans don't think of that as being a real case, but it was. They were working at their peaks for opposite companies, Jim Crockett Promotions and Vince McMahon's WWF at the time. So it was really cool to hear that on 83 Weeks.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you checking it out. It comes out every Monday. 83weeks.com is your place to check it out, and hit the subscribe button. Leave us a review if you dig what Eric and I are putting together.
One thing I like about your personal approach to your interviews, Conrad, is that you are really the advocate for the wrestling fan. You know, a lot of people like myself or other wrestling fans who maybe have had some interaction to various degrees with wrestlers, but we don't know necessarily how to get in touch with these guys. So when you're talking to Bruce Pritchard, who did the Brother Love character and also worked behind the scenes for the better part of, more than 20 years with WWE, and you're able to kind of press him on issues and really push for those hardcore answers, so to speak. For instance, the WWE ECW episode of both Something to Wrestle, the podcast, and the videocast version on the network, I thought that was really interesting because I could see your frustration that Bruce Pritchard didn't really have as much of an appreciation for the original ECW than, say, a Mike Messier or Conrad Thompson did, and you weren't shy about kind of pressing him on some issues.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it fun. Every now and again, I have to put on my interrogator hat, and we do a little cross-examination. And I think that adds another element to the show, and I enjoy it, and seemingly the audience does. Maybe Bruce not so much.
It's interesting that something like WWE ECW, believe it or not, I actually did kind of like the first year of it. For those that don't know, the World Wrestling Entertainment in about the 2005, 2006 era decided to bring together a third brand, so to speak. And what they used was ECW, which was this Philadelphia-based promotion that the WWE had the video rights to. And long story short, they kind of dropped the ball with it, although you can see shades of ECW even with NXT these days. If you really look hard enough, there is some lineage there or some shades of it.
Yeah, it was a fun topic because we had talked about it before on the show already, but the idea that we got to do it on video, I think added another layer because people really got to see how dismissive Bruce was of it and how passionate I was about it. And I think it made for a fun show.
Conrad, you've discussed that one of your most favorite live wrestling experiences as a fan was One Night Stand 2005, which I believe took place in New York. And so you attended that show as a fan. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, they announced they were bringing back, ECW for one night only, and it was going to be called One Night Stand, and they're doing it at the Hammerstein Ballroom there in New York City. And around that announcement, the independents who weren't going to be involved in that show for whatever reason decided to put together Hardcore Homecoming, and I managed to snag front row seats for both shows. And then all the other promotions sort of saw that as an opportunity and piggybacked it. So CZW had a show, the IWA had a show, Ring of Honor had a show. So a friend of mine from Georgia and I loaded up and flew to the Northeast, and we managed to snag front row seats for 5 shows. It was my favorite, even to this day, my favorite professional wrestling experience because I was able to see 5 totally different shows. One of those shows, by the way, had the, dream match from Naylor, which was Samoa Joe and the Necro Butcher. So the idea that you got to see that, but you also got to see, Terry Funk and Sabu and Shane Douglas and the Dudley Boys and some of those guys at Hardcore Homecoming and or One Night Stand was just outstanding. And I just don't know that any wrestling experience I've ever had could hold a candle to that. And it's a shame that we don't get, the original unedited version of the show because they can't air all that music. But the Sandman's entrance at One Night Stand is just something to see, man.
It's through the roof because he used the song Enter Sandman by Metallica. And so when you had the Sandman coming out to that song, that is tremendous. Sandman's a great guy. He's certainly the Sandman off camera and on camera. I was actually able to make a short film called My Sit Down with Sandman that'll be playing at the Somerville International Film Festival on July 14th. He's such a character, and that's one thing we can talk about, Conrad, is now that you're kind of working with the network and also just through your own podcasts, the amount of exposure or behind the scenes stuff with these pro wrestlers that you interact with, it certainly is interesting to go from, a fan watching TV and now you're interacting with these guys. What can you tell us about some of the shocking things you've seen or some of the eye-opening experiences you've had with the wrestlers as real-life people.
Well, just the idea that, you sort of envision these guys are one way and you assume that they just walk around that way all the time. Obviously, that's not the case. I mean, these guys have families and this is the way they provide for those families, just like you and I do through our regular traditional jobs. And, just seeing them interact sometimes with their family, you see a different side of maybe the character that we've seen on TV. And that's always yeah, an interesting dynamic because you do get a better feel for who someone really is, not necessarily the character they played on TV.
And what's also, speaking of family, congratulations to yourself, because from what I understand, you'll be getting married yourself at some point this year. So congratulations on that, Conrad.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And going back into the wrestling realm, have you ever gotten what they call heat, for something you've said or something a guest has said, where someone listening to this show, whether it's something to wrestle or something else to wrestle, has anyone really been offended by what's come up on the air, and that's been something you've had to deal with?
I mean, there's been a couple of people who are pretty fired up at Tony or myself, but nobody really anywhere else. I know that Bruce may have had a falling out or two along the way, but by and large, my experience has been a good one. There's a couple of folks who maybe weren't really excited about something Tony and I did, but that's really it.
What's interesting is coming up in the StarCast convention for the All In show, which is kind of promoted by Cody Rhodes, or Cody parenthesis Rhodes, as I'll call him, because legalities of over his own wrestling last name. Some really interesting things going on with that. Can you tell us about what StarCast and All In are?
All In is the biggest non-WWE show in 20 years, and it's self-promoted and self-funded by three guys who had a vision and believed in themselves, the Young Bucks and, of course, Cody Rhodes, as you mentioned. And they were able to lock down an arena in the suburbs of Chicago, Sears Center, and with a lot of faith, they came out of their own pocket and announced tickets, and ta-da, they sold that thing out in less than a half hour. And along the way, I pitched Cody on, hey, we should have a convention that is sort of piggybacking All In, much like WrestleCon or Access piggyback WrestleMania. This could be your thing. And if you did it with me, I wouldn't run wrestling. I just want to do a wrestling podcast convention. And he sort of thought, like everybody else, what the hell is that? And so I sent him a real plan of, hey, here's what I would do. And he dug it. So he dug it, the Bucks dug it, and now all of a sudden we've got a destination weekend for people to enjoy in the Chicago area over Labor Day.
What's interesting to me is I was watching Something Else to Wrestle on WWE Network last night, and I caught the StarCast baseball caps in the background of your own set. And I'm like, oh man, Conrad is getting that StarCast mentioned in a way, subliminally or not, on the network. And a friend of mine, a guy named JG, who I did a podcast last night with, Generating Heat, his big prediction was that the All In wrestling show, independent show, will be streamed on the network, the WWE network. JG made a real strong case for it that, Vince McMahon would love to have some of these guys featured on the network, because then you're crossovering the non-WWE fans into the WWE, and also the WWE fans who may not be aware of what's going on in the independent scene, suddenly they would be aware of it because it would be right there on the network, which seems to be a win-win for everybody. I don't know if you have any inside information or not, or if you can talk about it or not, but that was just something that we were discussing last night.
That's a fun fantasy booking, but that's what it is.
Well, that's what we're here for, right? And one thing I like to, speaking of fun fantasy booking, Conrad, I had to give you a lot of respect that I was listening to your episode about Slamboree 93, that Legends reunion show you did with Tony Schiavone. And you had speculated that wouldn't it have been interesting if instead of bringing out Paul Roma for the fourth member of the Four Horsemen way back in 1993, that Ric Flair brought out Dustin Rhodes. And Tony gave you an immediate compliment, and I thought, hey, that would have been a cool idea, because Dustin Rhodes, the history with Dusty Rhodes and the Four Horsemen, and it was interesting to see how your mind kind of came up with that. when you're doing these podcasts with your guests, Conrad, do you find your brain kind of going into booker mode or promoter mode a little bit?
No, that was really just a one-off, but I do think that, there would have been a fun way to introduce a new storyline there. But I mean, I really do understand why it didn't happen, but it would have been fun. I mean, it feels like there's a natural storyline that you could build off of there. But I mean, again, I get in that climate why they said, I don't know.
It was a thing where Paul Roma at the time especially, had a great physique. He was a great talent, maybe more so thought of as a tag team guy. But in a sense, I mean, I remember if you watch those tapes, Arn Anderson and Paul Roma were kind of more over than people give them credit for, I guess. But we're going really deep into the obscurity world of pro wrestling here, which is always fun. And that's the thing with some of your podcasts, Conrad. You might have a show which is labeled, the Dusty Rhodes tribute show, but within that 2 or 3 hour conversation, you and whether it's Eric Bischoff or Tony Schiavone or Ric Flair or Bruce Pritchard, you're going to be able to cover topics from that same time period that may not be labeled in the title of the show because there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea, man. We want to overwhelm you with content, and every now and again we'll take a hard left and just sort of pivot. And I think we get some of our best stories that way.
One thing I would say for people that might be watching this, the reason I would say to check out everything that Conrad Thompson is doing, especially if you're a wrestling fan in the 80s and 90s, and maybe don't even watch, what they call the current product. Your shows, your podcasts are really fun for fans from that generation, especially who remember Brother Love or they remember the Great American Bash and things like that. It's a great way to kind of relive those memories and those moments.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. What happened when is now on Wednesdays at WHWMonday.com. You can still get it on Monday if you support us on Patreon. You'll get the show 2 days early, ad-free, and we've got lots of fun bonus content on there. Well, just this past week, we taped 2 bonus episodes, one about NXT War Games, which is something Tony had never seen. He had never seen the WWE's version of War Games or NXT for that matter. And he never saw King of the Ring 2001. And most people remember that for the incredible car crash of a match, the Chicago street fight with Shane McMahon and, of course, Kurt Angle. And they go through the glass panels. And, I mean, Tony was just blown away with that show. So we're having a lot of fun with his show. And I feel like it's probably the sleeper of the 3 for sure.
And Kurt Angle doing that, kind of, I don't know if that was a belly to back suplex or a overhead suplex, trying to put Shane through the glass door, and it doesn't even break, and Shane takes a pretty dramatic drop on his head. We've both seen some of these wrestlers, a Shane McMahon, but more so like a Mick Foley and Kevin Owens, guys that just take such physical abuse. Being close to some of these wrestlers, Conrad, as you are, have you noticed that some of these guys are kind of the walking injured, like they're walking around through life, but they do carry the scars of battle with them?
No, you're exactly right. Usually, most of the time it's a back injury or it's a shoulder injury or a knee injury. Those are the 3 that I see most commonly. Bruce has got horrible knees and still struggles to get around every now and again. Rick has a very bad shoulder, and of course Tony is he's probably in need of some additional neck surgeries. He's had a neck surgery many years ago, but he's almost sort of immobile now. Whenever Tony needs to turn his head, he has to turn his whole upper body in order to do so.
I'm sorry to hear that because Tony Schiavone, I mean, he's a great storyteller, and even the work that he did with Jim Ross, going back to say the 1988 Great American Bash or that Jim Crockett, the end of the Crockett era, Tony Schiavone really was. I mean, what these guys were the soundtrack of our lives or the tapestry of our lives as wrestling fans, and so for me, I was good friends with Ox Baker, and Ox. I remember when he had hip surgery, he was 1,000 times better after he had the hip surgery, or even a Kevin Nash in more recent times with his knees. I mean, it's tough as a fan sometimes to think that these guys are going through these painful procedures in a profession that really is, you know, in a lot of ways, still a violent profession for the enjoyment of us fans.
Yeah, it's weird. You know, these guys get addicted to the roar of the crowd and the fandom, and maybe they hang on a little longer than they should. And as a result, they put themselves through the paces a lot more than you might imagine. And unfortunately, they've just got to live with that forever and ever.
One big thing that we should mention is that this past week, as we're taping this in June, late June of 2018, Conrad, the wrestling world mourned the death of Big Van Vader, the baby bull Leon White. I was a huge fan. Were you a big fan of Vader, Conrad?
Oh, a huge fan, man. You know, I was a big fan before I sort of got out of wrestling, but when I got back into wrestling, he had jumped over to the WWF, and I just had a lot of hope for him and his series with Shawn Michaels, or what I hoped would be a series with Shawn Michaels. I still think their match at SummerSlam 96 is, you know, a really great match, and it could have been something obviously much bigger with Survivor Series and Royal Rumble sort of rounding out the trilogy. At least that was the original plan we've all heard about. But going back to WCW, I think he's probably the best big man in the history of the business. His stuff he did with Cactus Jack made Cactus. His stuff he did with Sting really made Sting a credible champion and got him over in a way maybe he hadn't before. And I think, you know, he is partially responsible for the resurgence of Ric Flair. You know, Rick was obviously doing well in 93, but for him to step in as a backup plan for Sid at Starrcade and then have maybe the best storytelling in a match ever. I mean, just what a great job they did telling that story that, you know, Rick was putting his life on the line, stepping in here, and he was really rolling the dice to be in there with Vader. It was something to see, man.
And they had that whole Mean Gene Okerlund in the limousine with Ric Flair going, I believe it was to Charlotte. I don't think it was to Greensboro, but going to Charlotte to wrestle in the Charlotte Arena, I believe. Flair versus Vader at Starrcade 93, and Rick getting a busted tooth and having to fight, you know, with a bloodied mouth. And Vader, you know, as a fan, although we know, you know, kind of the deal with pro wrestling, when you see a guy like Vader who wrestled, you know, you could say stiff or snug, it was very believable that this was a guy you did not want to mess with.
Right, I would agree.
What is your earliest pro wrestling memory, Conrad? I know that Hulk Hogan was your early favorite, and then you became a big Ric Flair fan and Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, but do you remember the first time that you were a little kid and you clicked on the TV and there was wrestling? Do you have that memory?
WrestleMania 4 double tape VHS set, the summer of 1988.
I believe I heard you tell that story. Your family was back when we had VHS rental stores, and they came across a WrestleMania 4 tape and they said, hey, little Conrad, why don't you take this for the weekend? And what did you think? What do you think of that show then as compared to now? Have your views on it changed, or do you still love it?
No, it sucks. It was awful back then. But yeah, as a kid, it was the deal.
It was for those that don't know, it was an elaborate 16-man or 14-man tournament, and they had the Andre Hogan they got a second round bye and a big Shabazz finish and Macho Man getting the belt. The highlight of that show was probably just the Macho Man's performance, wrestling 4 times in the course of a day, always having a different costume with the lovely Elizabeth in different outfits for each match. So that's a pretty strong memory, but like you said, looking back at it now, you know, that 20-man battle royal and some of those, you know, Magnificent Morocco versus Ted DiBiase matches maybe don't live up to, say, Kenny Omega versus Okada, you know, at some show in Japan, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Speaking of the international scene, the WWE continues to do things like NXT in Europe now. What do you think of WWE kind of reaching out their tentacles to the more international audience?
I mean, I think it's great. You know, I think it's cool that WWE has finally embraced being more of a global brand, and they've certainly stretched out to where they did, you know, that special on the network from Japan, and obviously they've done a lot of stuff in England, and I'm really encouraged for what the future of wrestling looks like. It looks like we've got a whole new WWE from maybe what we had a few years ago.
Just this past week, I saw that they had the New Day and the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega kind of having this video game exhibition, so to speak. And it was really interesting that you had WWE talent and non-WWE talent, although they weren't competing in a physical wrestling match. They were competing at least for, mic work and crowd approval. What did you think of that situation?
I thought it was great, man. I thought it was really exciting that we were able to see something that we never thought we would see. And that's the WWE sort of working with someone who's really, really over that they don't actually own. I thought that was just a tremendous deal.
It does seem like perhaps with the Triple H or Stephanie McMahon rising to prominence, and maybe even Vince McMahon, because he's smart. I mean, Vince McMahon, I was telling JG last night on Generating Heat that Beyond the Mat, that 1997 film, there's actually an alternate commentary with Terry Funk and Mick Foley. And at one point, they're watching some international wrestling during the Beyond the Mat, and Mick Foley makes mention that Vince McMahon really wasn't into the hardcore stuff that was going on in Japan at the time. And Terry Funk somewhere made a comment that he said something to the effect of, well, Mick, that Vince McMahon wants to make $1 on every single wrestling match there is. If there's a wrestling match at a high school gym somewhere, he wants to make $1 off of it. So my point in telling that story with my very wobbly Terry Funk impersonation is that if there is a wrestling match going on somewhere in the world, if there's a ring with ropes, Vince McMahon does see the business in that.
Absolutely. And he wants wrestling to be his thing, much like, if you and I were to want to go blow our nose, we would say, hey, do you have a Kleenex? Or if we had a cut on our hand, we would say, hey, I need a Band-Aid. And if we were to sit down at lunch, you might say, hey, I'll take a Coke. We have sort of replaced those words, and the UFC's done a great job of this. Like, nobody says MMA in the mainstream. They say, oh, he's doing that ultimate fighting. And that's what he's trying to do, is any sort of wrestling should be WWE.
That's a good point. And I know that when you guys, meaning you and Bruce, went to the network, and that wasn't that long ago. That was just 3 or 4 months ago. But I remember, Conrad, that there was some concern from hardcore something to wrestle fans like myself that going to the network for something else to wrestle, would Bruce and Conrad be compromised a little bit? Would the content of their show be compromised? And I've been watching, and I don't think it really has, because what you guys are doing on the network, you kind of have to negotiate those waters, because sometimes there are legal issues. Sometimes the WWE might have a case that was in the past, but they don't want to poke the bear, so to speak, with some type of topic that might get them into hot water. And you guys have to be respectful of that. At the same time, you have a loyal fan base like myself and others that do expect, things to fly, so to speak, as far as what you can talk about. And so it is an interesting path that you're on with something else to wrestle. A good friend of mine, Tommy DiNucci, prefers something else to wrestle because he likes seeing you guys in the studio. He likes seeing the clips brought into it. I might prefer the original podcast version just because the visuals I already have in my memory bank. You know what I mean? Like I know all the matches you guys are talking about. So is there anything you want to say about, working with the network, or how it's been kind of a new thing for you, or informational? Anything you want to say about that?
No, listen, I dig the show. I think one of the fun things about the show is we're able to show things that really have never been shown before. You go back and you look at, say, our $1 Million Man episode, and you've got behind the scenes footage of them inside the jewelry store that nobody would have ever had a real reason to see. And the same thing with the Piper episode, getting to see him at the building at WrestleMania 19 or whatever it was. The idea that we had some of these behind the scene nuggets that we never really thought they'd have a reason to show. And they did the same thing with AJ Styles, unaired promos from 2001 when he had tryout matches, and Kenny Omega in developmental, and lots of little nuggets like that, Easter eggs, if you will, that really they don't have another reason to show. And I think that's part of the charm of the show.
It was cool to see in that $1 Million Man episode how the jeweler is making that belt, and he was actually thinking, the jeweler making the $1 Million Man belt, he was thinking it was going to be like an Elvis type of belt with a prominent belt buckle, but you guys were like, no, or Bruce Pritchard's like, no, this piece that you think is a centerpiece, that's got to go on the back because we want a championship belt for wrestling. And so that type of thing, you're right, is best illustrated with video.
Yeah, and we're hoping, that we get another chance to do it, for season 2. We had fun with season 1, and we're winding it down in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll get to keep the band together and do another round.
Well, I hope so as well, because it has been one of the most popular, if not the most popular, new additions to the network. And the WWE Network is an interesting thing because you have kind of things coming and going. Legends with JBL was popular for a while. The Stone Cold Steve Austin interview show was popular, and that seemed to end after he said some things to Dean Ambrose. And so all these nuances that go on with the network. But I mean, in this day and age, Conrad, it really is about content, content, content.
It really is. And that's the way WWE is sort of handling their business, is they're just trying to create as much content as possible. And it's pretty cool to see because they're able to look to sort of non-conventional concepts like something to wrestle. The idea that we were able to say, Wade Keller and Dave Meltzer and all that sort of stuff, that would have never happened a few years ago.
It's interesting to mention Dave Meltzer because even Tony Schiavone had to give him some credit that although some of the content of Dave Meltzer's stuff or the fact that he has to grade matches with stars and everything, although some wrestling people might take issue with that, the fact that you have these stacks and stacks or this website with all the back issues of Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer, how else would we know all this stuff? How else would we have these ways to trigger our memories if not for a guy like Dave Meltzer?
No, I totally agree. Dave has put in the heavy lifting and he's put in the time, and now it's a resource for the rest of us.
I would love to ask you about this, is that with kind of being in a position you're at now, Conrad, that in a relatively short time, 3 or 4 or 5 years, you've gone from, a fan who collected a lot of nostalgia, but now you're a wrestling personality. And what I really enjoy is that you kind of created a niche, or maybe not created it, but you really made the Conrad Thompson style of interview, which is you're getting the most information you can out of these personalities, the Tony Schiavones, the Eric Bischoffs, the Bruce Pritchards, but sometimes their memories lag a little bit. And as you said yourself, it's not always a way of kind of getting one over on the fans or having selective memory, but sometimes they legitimately just don't remember stuff, which when you're that person on the public stage, how are you supposed to remember every little nuance and detail of what you've done? But of course, us wrestling fans do want to have those gotchas on these guys. That's interesting to me.
It is, but realistically, if I was to ask you, hey, what did you do 17 years ago on this date? I mean, that's really, really hard to sort of recall. And some of those guys are better at sort of freestyling. Well, here's what I think I was doing. And other guys just like, I don't remember. And it's the idea that you can sort of push and I don't remember into a little detail here or there and sort of jog their memory that is really what we're looking for. It's interesting that, as wrestling fans, we're all sort of trying to chase that little extra thing we don't know.
We might think we know it all, but we always want that extra nugget of information. And, I do another wrestling podcast, which is hashtag What Have They Done to Our Sport? And, my co-host Cole Scharf we're both kind of interested in a guy that's helped us out, meaning Cole, Vince Russo, who you've actually spoken well about yourself, but someone like Eric Bischoff may not feel so fondly about Vince Russo, and those guys are the ones that actually had to work together. When you do certain theme episodes on a particular wrestler or wrestling personality, whether it's a Vince Russo or anybody else, do you ever feel that it would be a good follow-up show to have a Vince Russo come on and speak with you and Eric, or try to bridge that gap, or is that just something that's not really in the works?
Not in the works. We don't do guests on our shows. The whole Hulk Hogan thing was a one-off. It was an accident. It wasn't supposed to happen, but we're not planning to do a 3-man show or even an episode anytime soon.
Now, but when you do live events, you've been known to have surprise live events. I remember that there was I believe the Barclays Center, you guys did something a couple of months ago, right after an NBA basketball game. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We've done one for hockey and we've done one for basketball. We did a show right after an NHL game in Florida for the Panthers, and then right after a Nets game in Brooklyn for the Nets. So, yeah, we were excited to do those, and hopefully we have opportunities like that in the next year as well.
I think you're coming back to the Boston area in October, I believe, correct?
That's right. We'll be there on the 21st.
What can people expect, Conrad, when they come to a live, show with Conrad Thompson, whether it's with Eric Bischoff or Bruce Pritchard or even Tony Schiavone? I know it's expect the unexpected, but what's the general thing for those that have never been to a live event like this before?
We tell the stories that we can't tell on the podcast, mostly about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We do have visual aids there as well, and we sort of turn the tables on whoever the co-host is for me, and I allow the fans to sort of take my spot and ask questions. And at the end, we usually have some sort of a special guest run in. We don't usually advertise those names, but we'll have a third person join us, and we'll sort of beat them up a little bit and allow them the opportunity to tell some stories, and then the fans get a chance to ask them some questions as well. It's a super fast 2 hours. Time really flies when we're doing those.
Conrad, this is a great interview we're having. Is there any pro wrestlers on the independent scene or the international scene that you'd like to make note of as, hey, this is the guy or this is the woman's wrestler to take note of? Is there anyone, beyond the Kenny Omegas or people like that we all know about, is there anyone kind of up and coming or maybe a new NXT signee that you'd like to send a shout out to that the wrestling fans can kind of look into as a new talent?
Well, you really put me on the spot there. I probably need to think about that a little more. I know behind the scenes, I'm a huge fan of Matt Riddle. It's unfortunate that we don't see him on TV more than we actually get an opportunity to. I think anytime Teddy Hart's on TV, I wonder how long this will last. I saw him on MLW and over the weekend, and I thought, well, this is something I wasn't expecting. And I'm looking forward to MLW coming back and bringing back the Hart Foundation, because I grew up on the Hart Foundation, and the idea that we get more of that is intriguing. So they're putting together Davey Boy Jr. and Brian Pillman II and Teddy Hart for the new Hart Foundation. Something about that seems really, really interesting to me. But I think the sleeper guy, like the most entertaining guy who is really going all out right now, is PCO. And I'm hoping that he continues to sort of raise his profile. It's weird to me that a guy who's doing so much as he is right now has only got a few thousand followers on Twitter. I just don't think enough people have really seen the skits and the things he's putting together. He's one of the most fun follows in wrestling for sure.
Say that name again for us.
PCO, Pierre Carl Ouellette. You remember him from back in the day. Worked with both WWF and WCW, and now he's got a bit of a resurgence. We've sort of talked about him on the Pritchard Show as the Pirate, because that's the way he's referred to in the book from Shawn Michaels. But the character he's putting forth right now and the stuff he's doing is really, to me, the most underrated stuff out there. It's very reminiscent of some over-the-top broken Matt Hardy the first time we saw it.
Was this the same guy that had that killer match with Bret Hart at an In Your House pay-per-view? Is that the same guy?
Yeah.
That's incredible. He must have been his mid-20s back then, because that match was a good 20 years ago at this point. So that's fantastic, because I remember that people were talking about that In Your House match as a top match, and they were really impressed with this guy. And so it's good to hear that he's doing this now.
Yeah, he'll be 51 later this year, and he's out here doing moonsaults. And he's got skits where he's being electrocuted and nails driven up his nose. And this is quite the performer that we've got right now, especially when you consider the fact that he's 50 years old.
Right. I remember seeing something, it was from a couple of years ago, but it was actually Damian Demento doing some crazy promos where he's sitting in his home on his computer interacting with fans in a very angry type of way. And I was like, this is Damian Demento, the guy that lost to Undertaker on Raw back in '93, the first episode of Raw. And it's amazing that some of these guys never quite lose their gift for gab. But with the wrestler you're talking about, Pierre, that's great that he's still doing it.
Yep.
And I was going to ask you, Conrad, now that you've got all this exposure, you're having fun, is there any recent wrestling collectibles that you've acquired that you want to share with us as something cool that you came across or something you're looking to acquire for your collection?
I'm always looking for Ric Flair robes and old ring used belts. If you've got a lead on any of that, by all means, slide in my DMs. Hey, it's Conrad. I'm always looking for ring used titles and Ric Flair robes. Those are probably the two primary things that I collect. But if you've got anything fun, from the good old days, whether it's Macho Man or Dusty Rhodes or anybody in between, I'm probably interested. So yeah, I would love to use this as an opportunity to tell everybody that, hey, I'm collecting. And I'm a cash buyer.
I've got a Taz versus Sabu photograph that I took at Barely Legal. I'll just send you a copy as a special thanks for being on the Messier Mantra, because I happened to be there for that match as a young guy, Barely Legal. And what a great show that was. And just to know that there was only about 1,100 people in the room for that thing, because it was at the ECW arena, the bingo hall, so to speak, in Philly. And what a night that was for me.
Yeah, it's what I did for my senior trip, man. The idea that I got to go to the ECW arena was just something that I'll never forget. There's a lot of times when we see something big, and we're like, man, I really wish I could have been there to see that. And I was able to be there for an ECW show in early 1999. It's just maybe one of my favorite wrestling memories ever.
What was the main event on that? Was it like a Jerry Lynn, Just Incredible match, or do you recall?
Yeah, I do. It was CyberSlam 99. It was in April of 99, and it was a cage match where you had the Dudleys taking on Tommy Dreamer and New Jack. And I mean, it was one of those blood everywhere type of deals. And, that's exactly what I wanted, man. When they played Natural Born Killers, it was the coolest thing ever.
One thing that I didn't get to talk about too much was, on the Messier Mantra, I've had pro wrestling manager DJ Haven and also kind of his alter ego, film producer David Gear on this show. And I'd be remiss to ask you, is there any pro wrestling movies that you've enjoyed, like movies with a wrestling theme or a wrestler in a movie as an actor? Is there any movies that you'd like to mention that you enjoy, Conrad?
No Holds Barred is the greatest wrestling movie of all time, and it's not debatable.
My father took me to see that movie kind of as a surprise. He picked me up from school one day, and we go to see No Holds Barred, and I was surprised that my dad wanted to see it because that's how much over Hulk Hogan was at the time. That Hulk Hogan was over to the point that a father would take his son to see that movie, and Stan Hansen in that movie, and really a kind of a wild ride in that thing. I wasn't a biggest fan of the Zeus as a wrestling persona coming out of that thing, but it was still a good movie.
Absolutely, and it still stands up to me.
Is there a favorite pay-per-view that you have in your wrestling memories? Maybe not just a one-night stand, but something, let's say, that you watched from the television side of things, growing up or even in more adult years, Conrad?
Is there a what now?
Favorite pay-per-view show, like a favorite 3-hour, either WWE or WCW or ECW pay-per-view that maybe you didn't watch in person, like the one-night stand, but just watching from the side of the TV set. You know what I mean?
I wore out WrestleMania 5 and WrestleMania 6, and then later Royal Rumble 92, and eventually Royal Rumble 97. Those are probably the 4 shows that jump out to me the most. And I really enjoyed SummerSlam 1992, where you had, not 1992, but 1990 as well, when you had Earthquake and Hulk Hogan, and you had Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior in a steel cage. That was great stuff. Real quick, how is Ric Flair doing now? Rick, his influence on a lot of people, but just as an entertaining guy, you have a very close personal relationship with him, but how is Rick's body doing and the medical things? How's he doing right now? He's great, man. We've had a lot of good luck with him in recent months, and he's great. He couldn't be better. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because a couple years ago, people were worried about him. He had some medical stuff, and I actually felt that Rick was going to be okay, because this is a guy who lived through a plane crash and all these different things. So I'm glad to hear that.
At this time, I want to ask you, we got about a minute left, and I'm putting you on the spot again, but Messier Mantra is not complete without the guest sharing a personal mantra, motivation, a quote. Is there a mantra from Conrad Thompson on this special episode of Messier Mantra?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was a young guy, I asked a very successful man, hey, what can I do to wind up where you are? And he thought for a minute and he said, before you make any major decision, ask yourself two things. Number one, what's the worst thing that could happen if I did it? And number two, if that happened, could I live with it? And then act accordingly. And I've been able to do that through my entire career and just adult life. It has really helped me sort of make the right decisions. So I guess that's probably it. Ask yourself, whenever you're on the fence about something, should I or shouldn't I? Well, A, what's the worst thing that could happen? And B, if it does, can I live with it? Then you mitigate the risk and you really put in perspective whether or not this is a big deal and something you should be stressing out about to begin with. So that's probably it. It served me well in business and in my personal life, so I would recommend it.
Conrad Thompson, this has been a pleasure. Thanks again to our station manager, Cody Piexto, for putting together the technologies of Skype. Conrad Thompson, hey, it's Conrad. Thank you for your work with the pro wrestling world, and best to you in your life and marriage this coming year. Congratulations.
Thanks, man. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk a little wrestling with you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching this episode of Messier Mantra.